My name is Mary Joy Masetlane, and I'm the Youth Engagement Coordinator at WWF. The reason we are here today is to explore the opportunities that are available, as well as the accompanying risks and some of the implications for producing green hydrogen at scale. So as we know that green hydrogen is an energy carrier that is deemed key for hard-to-abate sectors such as aviation, ships, and transport. Our key speaker today is Farai. Farai is an energy analyst and project officer at WWF. He conducts economic and environmental research to assess the potential impacts of green hydrogen and other emission reduction strategies on businesses, people, as well as the environment. He also advises the national government, continental bodies, and industry sectors. For example, airlines and airports on decarbonizing aviation. I'd like to welcome Farai. Farai, thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to your talk today and learning more about some of these opportunities and risks.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you are well, and I hope you can all hear me. Welcome to this webinar, and thank you very much, Mary Joy, for your introduction. And I'm going to try to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to be doing to be also sharing a Menti slide to get some input from you guys throughout this webinar. So I will give a presentation, and then some of my fellow panelists will also pitch in with their expert perspectives as well. I hope you can all see my shared screen. Please, if you could go to menti.com on your phones, you can either scan the code on the screen, or you can go to menti.com and enter that code 68355802. We just want to get a sense in the room of your familiarity around the topic of green hydrogen, as well as derivatives, as well as to get an indication and sign of your engagement in this particular type of work. So this will just help to set the scene for the afternoon. Thank you very much. So the first kind of question that we just want to hear from you is, what comes to mind when you hear the term green hydrogen? Please feel free to go at it on menti.com and just give some of your inputs and reactions to that. You can just type in what comes to mind when you hear the term green hydrogen. Yeah, thank you very much. So we've got controversial. I think that is quite pertinent, and one of the reasons why we are doing this webinar. Expensive, energy, yes. Hydrogen, climate, clean air, controversial. Again, comes up. High water use, we see some of the challenges in the environment. I think whether good or bad, that's something that we explore in this topic. Thank you. We also have research. I think also topic of water is coming through as well. High water use, water intensive. So I think definitely that's shaping up to be one of the critical issues around the hydrogen. But definitely, and I think as you see quite from the term green hydrogen itself, we're seeing quite a lot of feedback around renewable energy, renewable sustainability and energy. So I think that's quite pertinent, because there is quite a big component that's related to energy. But I think we'll speak more also about the other use cases of green hydrogen. Thank you very much. And then just to get a sense in the room, are you currently involved in any work on green hydrogen and its derivatives? Just a yes and no. to get a sense in the room of who is involved in what. Okay, thank you for the responses, everyone. We do see that while there are some of you that are involved in this work, a lot of you are not involved. So I think and hope that at the end of this webinar, we'll address some of those issues and at least highlight some of these issues where you could have your input and also maybe consider these as areas of engagements going forward. Thank you. And thank you for your responses. And lastly, to those that are currently involved in green hydrogen work, if you could just please let us know. So I'm seeing the number of people that are increasing, that are involved in green hydrogen is increasing, but still most of us are not involved in this particular work. If yes, if you responded yes, lastly, could you just let us know? You can just type what type of work you are included. Is it policy work? Is it more on the technical side, some research or scientific work? Is it on the advocacy side of things? Engineering, we see activism and engineering. Just want to get a feel of where exactly you are participating or involved in this specific type of work. Okay, so we're seeing quite a lot of activism and policy work from, as well as some research and more on the technical side. Okay, so mostly what you're saying here is some policy and advocacy work. So hopefully as we engage in this webinar, we are going to be either equipping you guys and also getting additional work that can feed into the rest of the youth networks in terms of activism in the green hydrogen sector. So I'm going to leave it at that for now and go through my presentation. And then after that's the reactions of my fellow panelists. And then after that, we can move into a Q&A session. Thank you. So I'll share my screen again. So I'm going to highlight mostly around green hydrogen and the benefits. I'm not going to dwell so much on the benefits because I think most of us have heard some of these benefits, and more ideally what we want to explore is what are those inherent risks that are not often talked about and that we need to be aware of, and to try and look at some of those mechanisms as well as solutions or either advocacy efforts that we can do to try and counteract those negatives. So that's just the outline of the presentation that I'll be doing today. A Menti code again for participation later on after my presentations. So to start off, for those who may not be familiar with, so hydrogen itself, so it is in essence the most abundant element in the universe. But what is so abundant chemical element, but what is interesting is in nature, you rarely find it in itself, or so it needs to be extracted from other compounds that contain it. So mostly water, as some of you have indicated in that initial Menti poll. Also important is to notice that hydrogen itself is not an energy source. So rather it's a chemical carrier of energy. So what that means is effectively you need to put in energy to get or extract your hydrogen. So it could be either produced by or from an energy source. And this could include fossil fuels as well as renewable energy such as wind and solar, or as well as biomass, which is mostly plant matter. Also important to know that currently the majority of hydrogen is produced from fossil feedstocks such as coal or natural gas. And what we're seeing, or the current state of play, is that hydrogen, which is produced with little to zero emissions, does not yet exist at scale. So the world is still trying to answer questions about how to use green hydrogen in decarbonization of key sectors. And some of those questions that are being asked are, what production routes will be used to create this hydrogen? And also, as some of you indicated when they were talking about in the initial Menti poll, it was pointing to some of the use cases for hydrogen. So there's also a question of where in the economy should this hydrogen be used? and also questions around how to grow the green hydrogen with limited negative socioeconomic and environmental impacts. So also want to delve a little bit deeper into that in this afternoon. You might have heard of different classification of hydrogen. So there are many variations of these, but I will present to you what are the most common classifications. So you've got gray hydrogen, which is the most common production method at present. So that is usually producing it from fossil gas or natural gas. Brown hydrogen, so that is the second most common production method and the most carbon intensive. So production from coal, and that is some of the process that Sasol uses to produce the hydrogen for their operations. Is also some of it is from brown hydrogen. Then in some research, you also hear about so-called blue hydrogen. So this is where gray hydrogen that is produced from fossil gas is there, and in such a process, the carbon dioxide or the carbon emissions are captured. But there are some caveats to understand when you're talking about blue hydrogen. First of all, carbon capture is expensive and it's not yet developed to scale. And in most cases, currently, the captured carbon is not permanently stored. So in about 85 to 95% of the time, that carbon is released best into the atmosphere, which limits the overall environmental impacts that it has. And also, just to note that blue hydrogen has risk of fossil infrastructure lock-in because we're continuing to use the fossil fuel assets that are currently there, as well as the fossil fuel resources. And then what we're going to hone in today is the green hydrogen, which is produced from using renewable electricity. And it is probably the only type of hydrogen that is climate friendly in the long term. But it also has its own risks that we are going to delve in a little bit deeper later on. So I think what's also important to know around the potential applications of green hydrogen in decarbonization, it can fit in many different applications ranging from industry to transport, as well to power and heat. So in some forms, it's just green hydrogen in itself, and in some form, it's green hydrogen in its derivatives or otherwise products that are made from hydrogen. These include ammonia, as well as 6HY. So those are hydrocarbons. So things like jet fuel or diesel can be also produced using this green hydrogen. So there is a big drive in the world to use green hydrogen for decarbonization tools. We're seeing over 1,600 projects announced in various parts of the world, and some of the net zero pathways modeling that's been modeled over the years see approximately 10% of the world's total final energy consumption being in the form of green hydrogen. So there's definitely quite a move towards shifting to using it in various aspects of the economy. And then also important to highlight in terms of why this could be a good thing from a South African perspective. One is also the availability of resources that are required to produce green hydrogen and its derivatives. So I just put green hydrogen plus there to indicate green hydrogen and its derivatives. So some of the resources, including the renewables such as solar and wind, the critical minerals that are required for the processing and some of the technologies, and also biomass resources, which is the source of carbon that is needed in those hydrocarbons that I mentioned about earlier. I'll speak to it again in following slides. Also important to know that while we have assets that are currently highly carbon intensive, like the assets owned by Sasol and Petro SA, there are opportunities to use some of these assets as basis to use green hydrogen and to advance towards cleaner alternative fuels, as well as different chemical products that we use. So we do have that, so the country has competitive advantage in that stance. And as been mentioned earlier, the need to decarbonize some of the outer bed sectors such as aviation, maritime, steel, and chemicals. And also, I think what's important, if we do it right, the green hydrogen economy itself produces, it gives us an important export and industrialization opportunity, which could potentially result in green jobs as well as new economic opportunities. But we need to be careful around how we do essentially that. So hone in on some of the risks associated with green hydrogen and its derivatives, so green hydrogen plus, and trying to answer the question of what defines the sustainability of green hydrogen and its derivatives. So I've decided to base this here on the international PTX hubs for the environmental, economic, social, and governance framework, which tries to capture this concept around what the sustainability means. Just to define that, when you're talking about power to X or PTX, we are talking about processes in which renewable energy is converted to a variety of products. And this includes green hydrogen or, green ammonia, or green jet fuels and green steel, etc. So some of those elements of course, from an environmental perspective, we're looking at the energy, the carbon, and we can also looking about resources and also issues around recycling. I'll speak to that a little bit more. And from an economic point of view, what does this mean in terms of general economic growth? And are we looking at things like value addition? And of course, around the social dimensions, access to energy and resources, around issues around jobs, etc. And of course, need for proper governance in terms of policy, as well as issues around certification and standards. Speaking on from just delving in a little bit deeper on some of the environmental aspects, a critical component is the issue around additionality. So, and what we mean by that is that it's important and a key input for green hydrogen, as has been highlighted by you in that first Menti response, is the need of renewable energy and the energy input that goes into that process. So it's quite important that renewable energy itself is additional. So that is, in essence, we're saying for any green hydrogen project, we should not be taking away renewable energy that has already been put onto the grid or onto the system for other household or other industrial use, and diverting that to green hydrogen. We should have new dedicated investments into such operations. And I think also linked to this is knowing the issues around energy access that we have in South Africa and also other parts of the continent. It's very important to ensure that the deployment of renewables should aim to look at decarbonizing the grid, particularly in South Africa's case, where we have one of the most carbon-intensive grids in the world, to make sure that we prioritize that decarbonization of the grid, because that electricity filters into other aspects of the economy, which could be affected by that intensity. Also, I think, as highlighted by many of you, when we put up that Menti poll, was the water use, and I think that is quite a critical element or a critical risk in terms of green hydrogen. So it is dependent on pure water as an import. So it is important that we do not affect our freshwater ecosystems, especially in water-stressed countries like South Africa. That is quite key. And with the impacts of climate change, with more droughts in certain areas, definitely this is a big risk. So it is quite important that as these projects are being put up, and also looking at the communities where these projects are happening, how can we ensure, and what are those opportunities that are there to make sure that water stress is not increased, and that if there's a chance to actually increase water access to such communities. And an important point as well is in some of these projects, especially around linked or projects that are being planned around the coast, you hear instances of using water or seawater. But from the first point there, you actually need pure water for green hydrogen. So then that means that seawater has to go through a desalination process to provide the clean water for hydrogen production. So then the question then comes around, how do you dispose of that brine? Because just dumping it into the ocean can increase the salinity in a concentrated area, which could be harmful to the marine environment. Could you, and is the project looking to take that extra salt or the brine, the concentrated salt solution, and dumping it else somewhere on land? So in most of these projects, issues around this brine is not clearly communicated, and that is something that could affect communities deeply and would need further investigation. And also on the third point around biodiversity, it goes without saying, we also need, even if we are using renewable electricity, and renewable electricity in that form, be it solar panels, or it could also be wind farms, it needs proper siting. Otherwise, it will also interfere with biodiversity in certain regions. So it needs to make sure the proper siting of these plants for provision of renewable electricity for green hydrogen. And we also need to make sure that whatever land that is set aside for this green hydrogen plus value chain does not contribute to deforestation, including some of the areas that have been identified as high conservation value areas. So I think that is also quite critical. Also critical issue around raw materials. We hear, I'm sure most of you have heard a lot about the country and also South Africa's potential to be a supplier of some of the critical minerals for this renewable energy transition. So it goes without saying that if you're producing either speed solar panels or something for use or something else for using the green hydrogen value chain that is ethically and sustainably sourced, so it's quite clear or important that the lens that we look at this project is extended that far, and to increasingly move over circularity and reducing end-of-life waste that is associated with these technologies that we are using. So increased focus of this is also quite an important consideration to put. And it's also important, I want to highlight and introduce here this concept of life cycle greenhouse gas emissions. So life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, saying that we're looking at the entire project of green hydrogen from when you start, as you're saying, to start making the equipment needed, to going as far as producing the final product. We need to look at sort of the emissions, what goes into each step of that process, and if it's in the form of saying, let's say, citing some of these green hydrogen projects, what is the impact on the land that is being used for such projects? Are you clearing a forestry to set up a solar farm, for instance? What are the emissions in terms of the land use change emissions? What is also happening during the production of the different equipment that goes into this process, and also what is happening during the transport of these products? So often we hear about transporting certain green hydrogen projects from South Africa to overseas. What are the emissions produced in that? So that detailed life cycle view needs to be included whenever we're looking at assessing the impacts of these projects. Also quite important, there is the issue around the carbon source, especially when carbon is needed as an input for hydrogen derivatives. So I go back to things like methanol or other chemicals mostly, or sustainable aviation fuels or green jet fuels. You don't only need a carbon component. You don't only need a green hydrogen component. You also need a carbon component. So it's important to make sure that this carbon is sustainably sourced, and otherwise you negate all the climate benefits. It's also important if you are growing crops to provide the carbon for this hydrogen project, that could have severe impacts on what your climate benefits are. And in situations where in some projects that look to use carbon dioxide that is captured from the atmosphere, it's important that we use unavoidable sources of carbon. So for instance, processes like cement production, where the chemistry of those processes mean that you always produce CO2. It would not make sense, for instance, to say at a coal-fired plant, you're continuously burning coal and using that captured CO2 to then you have the carbon to produce your hydrocarbon or your green hydrogen derivative. So it's also some of those things that needs to come in the considerations of such work. This an example just shows what I was talking about in terms of a life cycle perspective. So just starting to see, just starting there to say, when you start from a point where you have a feedstock that is growing, the emissions that are associated with that feedstock, either collecting it or transporting it, as well as you transport that to a processing facility. And when you start to produce, in this case, you're making a jet fuel, that also means you're producing some CO2. When you transport again, you're producing some CO2. And all along that value chain, you're producing some CO2. So what this means is from a life cycle perspective, you also need to account for all those other emissions where this carbon leaks into the system and not just the end product. And that is some of the key considerations that are usually not highlighted when we hear about some of these projects that are coming into certain areas. Again, this is also just another example on the life cycle, and in this particular moment, it's looking also at the feedstock cultivation part. As I was saying, it's important to look to have that carbon source. And when you're now thinking about growing energy crops, it becomes even more dangerous from a climate perspective. That dangerous in the sense that you might not meet the climate benefits that you're looking for. So if potential growing of crops can lead to issues such as reduction in area for food production or loss of carbon stock. So you can imagine if you cut down an area that is heavily covered by indigenous trees or plants and to replace that with some certain crops, then you lose carbon both below ground, that is in the soil, as well above ground, that is the carbon stock itself. However, you can look at opportunities to grow some of these crops on areas such as abandoned agricultural land or degraded mining land, which is the case in some of the mining areas and from a South African perspective. Then we can also look to use other types of wastes, such as residues, waste-based residues, or invasive alien plants is a big problem in South Africa. And that can be used to produce the carbon source, and also to the issues around carbon capture, which I mentioned earlier on, but obviously making sure that in carbon capture, which is an energy intensive process, we're also using renewable energy for that carbon capture and not fossil energy. Just in terms of some of the economic and social dimensions, it's important to look at, of course, the creation of employment opportunities, for local communities, but not just employment, but also looking at the growth of local businesses and industries linked to this value chain. So in terms of value addition, and value addition could mean instead of just producing green hydrogen, can look at going further and producing finished products like green steel or green chemicals. And also the importance of procuring locally on some of this equipment and services, instead of always relying on importing some of these things that we can get locally. Also important to make sure that as these projects are sited in communities, it's important to see that the communities see the benefits linked to this. So for instance, in an area where a community does not have access to clean water or clean electricity or clean cooking, such a project could and should provide opportunities whereby some of that electricity for renewable energy can also service the electricity, And we've talked about how green hydrogen needs pure water. There's also an opportunity to link some of these projects to actually provide clean water for these communities. But there's currently no mechanisms that ensures and make sure that that happens. So definitely, I think that is a little more work and more advocacy that needs to take on place in there. Just also highlighting there in terms of proper health and safety standards, and they're quite critical to ensure the safety of all and well-being of all those are involved. So hydrogen itself is a flammable gas, so it is highly flammable. So it's make sure that we also have critical standards in place to negate these effects. And also ammonia, which is one of the green hydrogen derivatives, is quite toxic as well as flammable and corrosive. So it's quite dangerous also if these standards are not put in place. From a governance point of view, I think it's important to make sure that implement national economic and social policies that supports the individuals and communities that are affected by this transition, and ensures that there's minimum impact on the environment and the people and all those other services that are linked to this. And what's quite important, and we're hoping to get more feedback from our participants today, is involving the communities likely to be affected by this green hydrogen development. And it's important, and we know that some of these policies highlight and indicate mechanisms that should be followed to ensure that communities are involved. But then the real question is this happening on the ground, and to what extent, and how best can we engage in this? Also issue around training and reskilling. A lot of these jobs, some of them require reskilling and upskilling of women, youth, other disadvantaged communities. So how do we then ensure that and this reskilling is included and involved and included as part of this project development? Highlighting quickly some important considerations of green hydrogen development. I think first of all is to just highlight issue around certification. So there's currently certification to ensure that green hydrogen and these derivatives meet strict sustainability criteria. I'm just highlighting there an example of the principles and criteria for an organization called the Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials. So it's highlighting what you would need to meet in order to qualify that green hydrogen as a sustainable, or that green hydrogen derivative as sustainable. So it ranges from all between some of conforming to legal standards, looking at the climate benefits itself, issues around human rights and social development, also impact on soil, water, etc. So this is all well and good, but what we see is this certification is typically for the voluntary market. So that means, in some instances, companies are not forced to do these things, or projects are not forced to adhere to this. So we still need strong regulations to ensure that we enforce some of these inputs. Also, what's important to make sure or to do there is around the prioritizing use cases of green hydrogen. You would have seen and heard that green hydrogen is almost a buzzword over the last couple of years. But what's been happening now is, as projects are being started and the reality starts to kick in, we are seeing a case where the noise is starting to die down, because in some of these proposed use cases of green hydrogen, they either do not make sense from an economic point of view, and also because significant demand of green hydrogen would just elevate the pressure on those scarce resources that are highlighted area, and lead to potentially negative impacts on people, nature, and the environment. So it's important to prioritize the use of green hydrogen and derivatives where there are limited alternatives. So that's mostly around sectors such as steel, shipping, and aviation, and potentially also around long or mid storage. So it doesn't make sense, for instance, to I've highlighted some of the cases like light road there, traffic, where we know from an energy efficiency point of view, an electric car is much more efficient than a hydrogen car. which is more efficient than a combustion engine. But if you're comparing electric versus hydrogen, you're saying that it's more efficient to just use an electric car. And the reason being that in a hydrogen vehicle, you need electricity to make that hydrogen, and then that hydrogen to be used in a fuel cell electric vehicle, it needs to be converted back to electricity before it runs the car. So rather just have a good battery storage systems. Also just here, there is some discourse going around blending fossil gas and green hydrogen. It's important to highlight that this has limited emission reduction benefits and also increases the energy costs. And some of the cases that have been use cases that have been proposed for green hydrogen as an ingredient or reactant in conventional cement production. So hydrogen cannot be used in such an application, but it can be used as a source of high temperature heat in some of these use cases. Highlighting again the point that I've highlighted earlier around the limited carbon feedstock, which is also a challenge in itself. So therefore, this carbon feedstock should also be limited for cases with limited alternatives, as I've highlighted earlier. And I just want to highlight here as well issues around priority cases for green hydrogen. So this is a nice ladder that's been developed by Michael Labrick and associates. It's the hydrogen ladder. So it's a nice overview of where it makes sense to use green hydrogen and where it does not. So there it kind of gives you where there are much better alternatives and areas where there are no real alternatives. So in the issues around fertilizer, hydrogenation, and hydrocracking. So hydrocracking is petroleum, is refining, a refining process for the chemicals or fuels. There you don't really need have real alternatives and makes a good use case for hydrogen. And when you look at all these in yellow, these are applications that could be done with electricity or batteries. So whatever policies that we also need to develop around this topic need to reflect this thinking, because it's also not just good from an economic point of view, but also makes sense from reducing the resource use that we need in terms of producing the green hydrogen, which also limits the impacts that it could have on the environment and everything else. Just quickly highlighting some in terms of the policy landscape in South Africa. We do have the Hydrogen Society Roadmap from 2021, and the idea there is to provide a framework for integrating hydrogen technologies across various sectors to support South Africa's transition to low carbon economy. And based on the work from that Hydrogen Society roadmap, there was a green hydrogen commercialization strategy, aiming mostly to position South Africa as a leader in green hydrogen export. It also has a component where it looks to boost local demand while ensuring a just and energy transmission for affected communities. But then the real question is, are those just transition principles being investigated, and is there engagement with communities around that regard? Then we also have just energy transition investment plan, which is about 6 portfolios that it has outcomes for about 6 portfolios linked to decarbonization efforts. And one of those portfolios is green hydrogen. And there's a quote there, it proposes to roll out an engagement strategy on socioeconomic benefits of the green hydrogen industry and address local concerns with concrete benefits. So it's also important and try to really understand to see if these legislations and documents are moving towards what they were intended to do. To just close quickly there, I think it's important to know that South Africa is well in place to produce green hydrogen derivatives and could play a key role in transitioning those out to abate sectors. But we need to ensure that we only use truly renewable hydrogen that should be pursued, and ensure that we produce this hydrogen from excess and additional renewable energy from properly sited sites, properly identified sites, to avoid effects on biodiversity and water. In terms of policy from a South African perspective, as well as the developing world more broadly, those economic, environmental, and social dimensions really need to be included in the policy frameworks. So one, it's important to clearly show the role of green hydrogen in terms of how it decarbonizes our local economy. So there's a big emphasis on export and commercialization in that regard. But how can it be used in decarbonizing our own local economy? So this is where then links to the integrated energy plan comes in, which the Department of Transport, the Department of Energy should be coming up with, I think now from next year. So I think that is a key aspect where this linkage needs to happen. Also, potentially the risk that fossil fuel infrastructure lock-in, whereby you can have fossil-derived green hydrogen being used or highlighted as a transition that could, so that the initial use or move towards green hydrogen could be through fossil-derived hydrogen. So that also is a risk in itself and should be identified clearly from that policy perspective. And while policy mentions the need or the trickle-down effects of this green hydrogen economy, it does not really detail how those economic benefits can be realized by the affected or previously marginalized communities. So how can that be reflected? And also just important to ensure application and enforcement of strict sustainability principles to make sure that we actually are having the minimum impacts on the environment that we're having. So typically what happens is there are environmental impact assessments, but these EIAs and other things often are limited to just the initiation of the project, but once the project starts and during this life cycle, there's a high risk that some of those impacts, they fall through the cracks. So that I'm going to leave it there and end on to some of my fellow panelists to give their thoughts before we then open it up for a question and answer session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Farai. Thank you for that very interesting session. It was filled with a lot of information. And I learned a lot about the opportunities as well as some of the risks. And I must say that it's very interesting to learn that South Africa is well positioned and also rich with, the key minerals that are needed to produce green hydrogen. And also the fact that this will enable the country to take an advantageous economic position should we choose to, should it be a success to scale the green hydrogen. So thank you for that. And now for the reaction, I'd like to welcome Thando, and also Thando, thank you so much. Thando is a coordinator at the South African Climate Action Network. He will be taking us through some of his thoughts on the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, MJ. Thank you to Farai as well. I really enjoyed that intervention. If I could just ask, I've got a short presentation that I'd like to share. So I'm not sure if I've got the rights to just yet. Can you just confirm this for me, please? And then also whilst we're waiting for that, just to say, just to quickly talk a little bit about an SACAN. SACAN is, okay, I'm not able to share yet. SACAN is a network-based organization. Most of our members traverse climate change space. So they work in from big organizations to small organizations, grassroots formations. And so my input today is largely based on some of the conversations that various colleagues in the sector have had over time on the subject of green hydrogen. including at COP. And so, yeah, my reflections are just that, just some initial reflections. And I'd be keen if there are any additional questions or if anyone would like to take up anything that I'm about to say forward, I'd be happy to do so. So yeah, some of the things that I'm gonna share, I think Farai has already touched on. And so it's just really just from a civil society perspective, more so around some opportunities for where and how we could get involved. And the first one is just to say that there is the recognition of the role that hydrogen can play in the country, both in our country and other countries as well, but specifically within SA in this case. As we know that many of the plans of the private sector predominantly and the state center hydrogen. And it's because of what we've just heard now about its potential to be a very suitable energy carrier to replace coal and other fossil fuels. There are just some niggly which is what I'm going to be discussing today, that we kind of have to work through as a collective, and that collective would be ourselves as social partners. So the state, government, state, private sector, organized labor, and civil society, just speaking in broad terms. The picture that you see on your right-hand side of the screen, at least I hope it's on your right, is just a quick snapshot of where the hydrogen projects are currently operational in the country. You see that only one is actually active being it's producing hydrogen. The other ones are still in the planning phases or in various phases of planning. But one thing that I just wanted to quickly highlight is if you look at those locations outside of the Sasolburg and Secunda facilities, which directly speak to Sasol, the other ones are really in very far-flung areas of the respective provinces. If the most best located ones are the ones along the coast, of course, because it's easy to transport from that side, both along South Africa's east and west coasts. But most of the work currently underway is in the interior of the country, and it's away from city centers, if you will. And so it does hold quite a bit of promise for rural development. Again, it's just a matter of the modality through which we can do that kind of development. So just quickly then, as a decarbonization tool, it's been recognized again through the previous intervention that it can be an intervention, right? A decarbonization tool. Certainly, this is how we've planned for it, particularly in the PCC and the PMU and others, because of some of those hard to abate sectors. And I think I don't want to repeat too much, but I think steel is one of them, cement is the other one, transport is the other one. And I think the Anglo one specifically is using transport, because I remember last year, and I'm sure many of us might remember it as well, the president was there to launch the truck that Anglo American had designed. And it's really a functional facility for their mine. And if it can get to a large commercial scale, then it means good things, at least for those in that industry. The extent to which it means good things for all of us as society, I think for us is still one of those things that are largely still to be determined. Certainly it will benefit some and it won't benefit others, but how do we get that middle piece fixed, I think is a key component. In our net zero plans and targets, so this would be looking at our NDC, it would be looking at our low emissions development strategy. Green hydrogen has in the PCC document, so the jet plans as well. Green hydrogen has been positioned quite highly there as well. And it's for obvious reasons. I think all of these have been touched on, but just to also re-emphasize that, particularly for the South African case, the one major benefit of green hydrogen is that it can be a major player within our energy mix. I think this one of the energy mix typically can be a contentious subject matter, but if we think about it, and this is how personally I like to think about it, and that is in financial terms, if you will, right? If you speak to any financial advisor at any point, whether early in your career, late in your career, they will almost always tell you unilaterally that in order to mitigate your risk, you need to diversify your portfolio. And so similarly within the energy mix, in order to mitigate overexposure in any one particular technology, the best thing to do is to have a bit of an energy mix. And I think for particularly the large component that South Africa has for coal, hydrogen presents a very, very good opportunity to eat away at some of that mix that and coal specifically is so dominant within our economy. The graph on your right-hand side, again, just shows what the economic opportunities look like respective to the relevant policy documents that South Africa has put out. You can see there the IRP Integrated Resource Plan, the TDP is the Transmission Development Plan. So that's Eskom's document for when they're looking to expand the grid. So there's two components of it mainly that I wanted to touch on. The first one is just the actual grid infrastructure that's there, where the grid isn't yet geared towards things like smart metering and bi-directional metering and so on. So the upgrade to that grid in that degree that would be covered in the TDP. The second component that would be covered is then what's called last mile, where last mile communities where the grid only gets to a particular point and then certain communities don't have access. So the TDP would outline those areas and the plans to which they could extend then grid access to areas that didn't previously have. Then we obviously know the JET-IP, and then we also know that there is a hydrogen strategy that is currently under development. But if you look at then these respective graphs, they just touch on what the different energy capacities or technologies that we want to be using are, and then what are the respective opportunities, and particularly trying to point out where then hydrogen fits in all of these. And you can see it's indicated by these little diamond icons over there. To go back to an earlier point around where we see the development of green hydrogen within the corridors of South Africa, a lot of it is going to be found in your rural communities or rural towns. And so again, it means good things in terms of development for those particular towns, right? And that's something that we would want to see, particularly as civil society, is how many jobs can be created, what is the nature of those jobs that will be created, excuse me, and hopefully to whatever degree the duration of some of those jobs is quite important so that a person can at least as best as possible try to plan for their lives. So to present the challenges with hydrogen, I don't think would be a fair assessment. There are certain opportunities. Again, it's just a question of how do we as a collective try to make sure that those benefits accrue to as many people as possible, to as wide a sector of society as possible, as opposed to a narrow one. But now going over then into just some challenges, and we'll start off with just some considerations. The first one that I'd like to highlight is this one of the inclusive development. And I think Farai to touch on it. And really inclusive development just speaks to the extent to which if you're sitting in a particular municipality, your municipality has been positioned to be one of the ones where when your development of green hydrogen is going to be happening, to what extent then the residents of that particular locality involved in the development, not only in the planning phases, but also in the designing of what that end state would look like. So in other words, if you're in a town where there's no electricity, right, but there's green hydrogen potential, and the state has got plans to develop green hydrogen in your area, what would a developed area in your respect look like? And to what extent would you as an individual, organization, a company, be able to influence what the end picture looks like, right? And then in all of that is then the mechanisms that help allow us. So your public participation being one such mechanism. The second one is then addressing the social impacts. I mean, I'm going to touch on it in the next slide, but most notably would be the water one, right? The one of the key decisions that I think a country like South Africa has to face head on as well is if we're going through water challenges as we are at the moment, how does one make the decision between water that would be used for the generation of power? How would it be versus household consumption versus farming, for instance? And knowing that all of those decisions have direct impact on society. And so again, it speaks to the question of mechanisms that are involved there. Then the last one, and I know Farrell's touched on this one, is community engagement. If you look at the renewable energy, the REI4P, REI4P had a quite strong community engagement component, community development component. And so similar to the earlier point, to what degree are then, particularly those what's called fence line communities, which are living right around where the facility will be, to what extent will they be involved in the decisions that are going to impact them? Just on the environmental impacts and the sustainability thereof, the top picture on your right-hand side, I think I've linked where I got the picture from, but I'll put it, I forgot the name now, but I'll put it in it's been tagged on this thing. It's just to kind of show a little bit of a comparison, specifically when we're talking about how much power is needed to generate, to purify water and various water sources. So you've got groundwater, which needs 2 kilowatt hours. You've got tested wastewater, treated wastewater, which is 2.2 kilowatt hours. And then you've got seawater, which is the most energy intensive amongst those three, which is then at 7 kilowatt hours, right? When you compare then that with the electrolysis process within the green hydrogen, which is effectively the process to generate the electricity from the water, that uses 5,000 kilowatt hours. And this is where I think the key about the green element comes into effect and really makes hydrogen in some respects come into its own, is that if we didn't employ renewables, for instance, that 5,000 kilowatt hours would typically come from coal, right? And if we do expand our renewable energy as it is purported at the moment, then at least we know that some of that 5,000 will be coming from renewables, some of it will be coming then from coal, because that's predominantly what we use in the country. The other aspect then is when you look at just land mass and land use, and then the graphic at the bottom is just a snapshot to show what a typical facility might look like on top of the ground, right? Of course, because we're talking about hydrogen, water is, and access to water body is critical. And so these would not happen outside of a space where there's secured water availability. But again, it brings this question back of, well, should it then be for human consumption versus power generation versus agriculture, for instance? These are all questions that would need to be debated as time goes. And then, of course, similar with the mining aspect is, once you disrupt the natural environment above ground, we have to know the impacts of that. And of course, in many respects, environmental impact assessments have been compiled to determine this exactly. But similarly to what we've seen in other sectors, most notably mining, is that you can do the EIA, but sometimes the project will still go ahead, even if the EIA says that this is it might have a serious adverse impact on the environment, but because of the developmental needs that we have as a country, some of these decisions are then pushed forward. So we have to always be aware of what decisions that we're making, what the impacts are of those decisions that we're making, and take a really balanced view about what it is that we want as a society and what we want our society to be reflective of. Another key aspect then is this one on youth engagement and advocacy. I mean, if we're just frank with each other, right, for a moment, a lot of so when you look at the plans for renewable for hydrogen development in the country, it's still very much in its nascent stage. The industry will probably be fully developed in about 15 years, right? Like fully developed with sufficient kind of market players, sufficient enough industry, decent enough returns for those obviously who are invested there. It will take about 15 years. It might take sooner depending on the pace at which technology develops, but that's more or less what the literature is saying. Now, if we're looking 15 years hence, what involvement are young people having now, noting that they're going to be educated, many of them, they still have to be educated, many of them. There's going to be many of them that still have to be responsible for the decisions that were taken at a time that they were not there. And to what extent do they understand on a technical side and a technological side, the usage of green hydrogen. So it becomes necessary that, in the plans and discussions at this nascent stage already, that young people are involved, both from technical and an engineering side and an advocacy side as well. The technical side, just in this case, might mean from a research component, but engineering is obviously from the doing, and then those of us in civil society would do predominantly the advocacy work. Then, just to conclude, the entire presentation is not necessarily positioned to say yay or nay on green hydrogen, but more so is just to highlight and perhaps emphasize points in which Farai touched on, which might be so-called sticky issues. But most notably is to recognize the fact that as a country, we've got climate goals. And in order for us to be able to meet our climate goals, technology deployment is a massive, massive component to that. But in just choosing particular technology options without factoring in key considerations might put us in a position where we're worse off than where we are today. And so this is the beauty of spaces like this one, and spaces like the PCC, where some of these conversations are had, and other spaces as well, is that we all come together as social partners to be able to discuss at varying degrees what this means and what we'd like it to mean for our respective quarters. And being a climate-focused organization, right? It's for us, it's excuse me, for us, it's necessary, particularly a climate justice component, which I didn't touch on too much in this presentation, but effectively, it's just about how do we ensure that as we move to a new dispensation of power generation, that we do not recreate some of the injustices of the past, and specifically with the ever increasing climate impacts that we're seeing, how do we take decisions that are not going to have an adverse impact on our climate moving forward? Hence, it becomes necessary then that we have the participation of youth. We try to make the space as inclusive as possible. We try to bring as many people to the table as it were, or at least inform as many people as possible around both the benefits and the disadvantages or the challenges of a technology option. And then we find a way collectively to then come up with an agreement wherein we can all hold a certain level of responsibility for the outcome, whether positive or negative, but hopefully positive, obviously. And so, yeah, those are just like just some reactions to the presentation. I'm hoping, Farai, that you will share it with us, because there's a lot of figures that you've put there that I found very, very interesting, and that I would like to have a closer look at for our own work as well. So I'd appreciate that if possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tando. Thank you for also delving deeper into some of the social aspects as well as the environmental concerns. And most importantly, our role as youth, the role that we can play in such spaces. And I also believe that it's important that we know that such spaces do exist, and that our contribution and perspective is also important and valuable. Thank you for that. So I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. I've seen a few questions. There's one question in the Q&A. Tanasha says, what are the key factors influencing the scalability of green hydrogen production?
Thanks, Mary Joy. Before we answer that question, I believe Nokwe Taba also has a reaction.
Apologies for that.
Thank you.
Hi, Nokwe.
Hi, Mary Jane. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nogwe from WWF, and I'm a climate science officer there. I'll just briefly speak over the water impacts of green hydrogen. The previous speakers have already, I think, given us quite a bit to chew on and a lot to think about when it comes to the water impacts of green hydrogen in the country, because we all know green hydrogen has the potential and is exciting for decarbonizing industries in South Africa, but it also raises significant concerns about water use in a water scarce country. And one of the issues is the water demand for electrolysis. So that, I think it's the process of separating the hydrogen from the oxygen. So that process requires large amounts of water. And South Africa's key hubs, such as that have been identified. So if you remember that map Tando showed, and one of the areas is Northern Cape and as well as Eastern Cape. And these are regions that are particularly arid and they face large amounts of water shortages throughout the year. So it's a great concern for such areas to be flagged as potential areas for green hydrogen. There's also a concern for competing water uses. So water for green hydrogen could compete for other critical uses such as agriculture, which is already a water intensive activity, but one that's important because that's where we get our food from, as well as municipal supply. There are lots of communities that face drinking water challenges, and these could be further impacted. And some of these communities or municipalities are within areas that are water scarce. And then there are also actually legal obligations to maintain certain amount of water flows but for government so that the ecosystems are not compromised. So green hydrogen might put that under jeopardy. Desalination was also spoken of as a solution, that being considered to avoid the use of fresh water for electrolysis in producing green hydrogen, but that also comes with challenges in that desalination is a energy intensive, should I say, activity. So it consumes a lot of energy and offsetting, and it could offset the green hydrogen's environmental benefits unless it's fully sort of powered, by renewables. Thus making it, the whole process then a bit more like green. And Farai touched on the brine disposal and that the salt solution that comes out from desalinizing ocean or salt seawater is brine, and that can harm marine ecosystems if it's not handled. And in most parts, especially in the Eastern Cape, there are small scale fisheries communities and that's where and how these community members get their livelihoods from. So if we're to desalinize and dump brine into the ocean and thus affect the marine population and fish populations there, that'll affect a lot of people's livelihoods, which is how, well, yeah, they get or earn a livelihood. It also could impact vulnerable communities. So the use of water for hydrogen could disproportionately affect rural and marginalized communities, which already have limited water. So we need to plan critically to prevent this further inequality, especially in the context of the just transition and taking everyone, developing things and taking everyone with us along the way. And so South Africa really needs to integrate water management policies to balance the industrial water needs with those of agriculture, communities, as well as environmental needs, so that it's a sustainable and well-balanced sort of development path. So new sustainability standards will be important to minimize this water wastage within within green hydrogen production. So yeah, I think that's all in a nutshell that I'll say now that most of the inputs were actually said, and I'm just echoing what the other speakers said. So thanks, guys. That's all from me.
Thanks, Taba. Thank you for that. We'll now open the floor for Q&A. Farai, would you like to answer that question? I'll just read it again. Tanasha is asking, what are the key factors influencing the scalability of green hydrogen production?
Thank you very much, Tanasha, for your question. So I think at this moment, the scalability of green hydrogen is driven mostly by cost. From a cost perspective, if you are an investor or a renewable developer, you're looking at how much you can sell that product based on how much can you sell it for and what are your returns on that. So typically, green hydrogen is still much more expensive than your conventional or fossil fuel green hydrogen. So it's about maybe it can range from anywhere from 2 to 3 times more expensive. And the question needs around how do you drive down that cost gap? And there are two aspects of it. So one is obviously looking at how can you drive down the cost of green hydrogen itself, and then you have to look at what are the cost drivers of green hydrogen production. So just breaking down on that a little bit further, the first is that electricity is the highest cost component. So you need a lot of renewable electricity, as Tando mentioned in his schematic for green hydrogen production, for the electrolysis part. So while we have seen over the years that the renewable electricity price has been increasing, we still need a lot of it. And the bottleneck there is the efficiency of the electrolyzer unit. So that is how much or electricity is required to produce green hydrogen from a certain amount of water. So that electricity from a technological perspective is still low, and there's research and work being done to increase that efficiency. So if that happens, then you'll be able to produce more hydrogen from the same amount of electricity and lower renewable electricity costs. So that's sort of one of the thing influencing the scalability. The other part is the scale of the electrolyzer unit itself. So typically these days or nowadays, the operational electrolyzers are very small. So the smaller the unit, the higher the cost. So you need a higher electrolyzer unit to benefit from economies of scale. And that will, as technology improves, also drive down the cost. And then also the other thing is also looking at the green hydrogen derivatives, particularly those that need hydrocarbons. So things like green chemicals or sustainable aviation fuels, they are limited by the availability of sustainable carbon. I mentioned that in my projects. So that's why you see most of the projects in South Africa around green hydrogen, either as green hydrogen or ammonia, because you don't have the carbon component. So you don't have projects that have looked to increase or include the carbon aspect, because it is very hard to find sustainable carbon that meets those different metrics. And also to say these three interventions that I mentioned, the efficiency of the electrolyzer, and the second one being the size of the electrolyzer and the green carbon, are looking at how do you reduce the cost of green hydrogen. We also need, as Tando was mentioning in his presentation, that it's part of our decarbonization efforts, and there's a reason why we are doing green hydrogen. So I think the thinking also needs to move towards kind of some of the punitive measures for emitting. So that's where your things like your carbon tax come in, or your cost of carbon. And if some point, if your cost of carbon is high enough and you put that or stick it up on your current fossil derived hydrogen price, then at some point, coupled with reducing the reduction in green hydrogen price, you can get to a certain point where it becomes more economically attractive, and therefore it will be more it will increase investor appetite. So hope that answers the questions. Yeah.
Thanks, Farai. We do have another question. How can we ensure that green hydrogen production methods are sustainable and environmentally friendly?
And on that second question, I think we have tried to address some of those questions, both in my presentation as well as the interventions from Tando, as well as Nokwetaba's inputs. So it's really looking at what are some of those impacts that the potential negative impacts that can come from green hydrogen, and how do we police them? Because we do know the various negative impacts that are there, and like many things in policy, we can put measures and stream and we can put different measures, but the question really comes to how do we enforce it? How do you make it happen? So what is happening in what is the so-called voluntary market? So this is where either market or either companies are trying to do something sustainable. They can get certification of a product, and when you certify a certain product, it can sort of there can be some external auditing that happens to tick certain boxes, all those different criteria to say this was really sustainable and green. But this does not apply to all the projects, and therefore there's quite the need for our own regulations, either if we're developing green hydrogen in South Africa, to make sure that those same standards, social and environment and otherwise, can then be included. So we really need to ensure that that's a critical part of the regulations. And maybe if we cannot get that into the regulations, we can also look to mechanisms that have been done in Europe and elsewhere, whereby the certification or the independent sustainability certification can sort of be adopted in a way by the governing state as the sustainability standard. So that's something that we can adopt at start as we develop our own capacity and moving forward.
Thank you. We do have more questions. The one from Martin says, in regard to Lesotho and South Africa, can there be agreement adjustment given the amount of water Lesotho has and it being used as hydropower stations at their half to about 80% capacity?
I'll attempt to answer that one. Maybe Nokwe or Sandra, you can come in there as well. But I think also it's not only about the water used for hydropower. In hydropower, then that water has to go through a turbine, and from that turbine, it generates electricity. But from the Highlands water project, I think the water issues in Gauteng are currently well documented in terms of there not being sufficient water in some instances, and also an expansion project happening in that side of the world to actually increase water availability for household use. So that is a classical case of green hydrogen versus the day-to-day needs of people. So if we're to saying yes, there could be some of that water can be used for hydropower. What could then happen is down the stream after that turbine, that water could then, if you convert that water to green hydrogen, then you lose that water and reduce the amount of water that could then flow down to Joburg for instance, for people to have water. So I think that needs to be looked at holistically from that perspective, to ensure that people do have water. And I think that is a key aspect of the balancing that needs to happen in terms of green hydrogen development.
Thanks, Farai. James is asking, how can we integrate the solar thermal power with green hydrogen production?
Yeah, thank you for that question as well, James. And I think from my understanding, the solar thermal will be a way to heat water to high temperatures using thermal energy. So I think the role that it could play in a electrolysis process, I think you would need to achieve a certain temperature. I'm not sure what it is for the electrolysis process itself. So potential role that you could have there is for the to have the solar thermal preheating some of that water for before you do your electrolysis. Yeah, I haven't looked at that in detail, but I think that is one way you would do it. Ultimately, you can just use that renewable electricity for the electrolysis process itself.
Thank you. There's also a hand from Keboleng Kosi.
Hi.
Hello, we can hear you.
I don't know whether you hear me very well.
Yes, very well.
Okay,
Thank you.
okay. Thank you very much for the opportunity. My first question is that based on what you already presented before us, so how can we create an awareness in the community as an individuals, or we must wait until government act with their policies? And the second one is that as I have no doubt that you have a bondage of intercommunication with the government. So how they act in terms of in terms of showing support.
Thank you very much. That's a brilliant question. Tando, would
Yes.
you like to take that one? Is that all?
Yes. Is that all?
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Um,
Tando, over to
I
you.
don't mind. All right. Do you mind just repeating the question?
Sibolongosi, please say your question again for Tando.
Okay. No problem. Thank you very much. My first question is that based on what you presented before us, so how can we create an awareness in the community as an individuals, or we must wait until government act with their policies, which is the first one. And the second one is that, as I have no doubt that you have a bondage of intercommunication with the government. So how they act in terms of showing support.
Okay, so we can start with the first one.
Yes.
Look, the first thing I always say to a question similar to this one is that Yabona now you've joined the WWF say can call or WWF call, right? So it's important to
Yes.
first link up with organizations that are familiar with the subject matter, right? It's always important as a first step because then through such organizations, you then get access to this type of information and you can get access to the resources. So not only would
Yes.
you be able to get access to price presentation, for instance, of mine, but any other information that we might sit with, that we might look at through the relationship that you have with that organization, you can get then access to that. And then from there, it's necessary then that whether you do it as an individual or through whatever community structure that you might have or be a part of, is to then do whatever kind of public awareness, public education that you think would be necessary.
Yes.
So let's say
Yes.
in Priska, which hydrogen
Yes.
is going to be. If you're in Priska, you go out to the community, you inform them about what the technology is and what it might mean for you and your community, right? If you
Yes.
wanted to, you can then bring in ourselves to come in and share insights, technical insights or whatever, to help better inform people. And then from
Yes.
there, it's just really it just gets more and more detailed in there because the more people know, the more they want to know, the more questions they have, and so it just continues in that way. So that's really the best place to start is try to contact
Yes.
an organization that does that. When it comes
Mm.
to this relationship with government, um,
Yes.
that one will always be a difficult one if we just assume that uh, the state is going to be against anything that the community bring. The major issue that I've come to learn that the state has when it comes to some of these processes is that it's either the people that they're communicating with are not familiar with what's being discussed, and so
Mm.
therefore are bringing questions that are unrelated to the room, and so oftentimes aren't in a position to be able to answer them. In other
Yes.
instances, it might be a situation of the space is just being used for different reasons compared to the one that it was communicated for, right? Which also then
Yes.
creates an additional problem. So the thing to do, again, I would say is if you have this kind of a relationship with organizations like ours, then when you're approaching government or when you're having a space with the state, you're in a position to do some homework, you know what the content is going to be discussed. And also you now can ask very straightforward questions about what it might mean for you as a specific community. And then from
Mm.
there, you typically find that the state is quite responsive. And then for me, which is something that I also try to encourage people to do is what level of involvement and engagement would you guys want to have
Mm.
as either a community or an organization in that particular project, so that you're no longer just there sitting waiting. If there's some kind of role that you guys can play, then that's what you think about, and you can do that in collaboration with an organization like ours or WWF. I hope.
Yes. Yes, I'm answered. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gabor, may you please mute your mic?
Oh, okay, okay.
You. Roseanne has their hand up.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm not a youth, but I'd like to just maybe ask, make a point. And I'm not sure, because I did miss some of this, is if it has been identified within that green hydrogen value chain. I hear somebody asked about how do we create awareness, etc. But what about the economic or the work employment opportunities that, for instance, young people could have, or businesses that they could be involved in that could also benefit from this green hydrogen? We just saw the money that I think it was the Germans who just gave South Africa for green hydrogen as well. So, also what are the economic opportunities, I guess, for young people or emerging businesses? And maybe since this is a long-term thing, what are the education opportunities in terms of study that young people could get into, where they could have a career within this path? Thank you.
Andrew, you also have your hand up.
Good afternoon. My name is Mamello Mahasala, and I'm attending the meeting with Mr. Andrew. So I wanted to say something in regards to the presentations and the statement that the other guy that just made. I forgot to see the name. I'm sorry for that. I just wanted to mention that we should also bear in mind that our communities we are in would like to involve them in the hydrogen and climate change. But we should also bear in mind that there are people, I mean youth, that are unemployable. There are those who are unemployed, and there are those that are unemployable. Those that are unemployable are there for money, not for passion. Those that are unemployed, they are there for money and passion. So it poses a danger to the organizations, maybe perhaps if they have partnerships with government departments that can give opportunities to the youth. So it poses a challenge to us as organizations, because we tend to keep on having conflicts, in the end having to change people now and then, and it affects the image of the organization. So I'm suggesting that perhaps maybe if we organizations can maybe first change the mindset of the community in regards to money, because people want more money and less work. Maybe if we can have that concept in our mind to say, how are we going to approach youth? Because youth want money, not just money, but money. So information sessions needs to be rendered, and also advocacy and lobbying to institutions that the government has put in place to give assistance to those who want to open some businesses or cooperatives or anything kind of support in terms of hydrogen and climate change. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, could I take those two questions?
Yes, yes.
All right. So I'll try to respond to them both at once, if you'd allow me. I think, yeah, let's start maybe with the second one. You know, it's not a bad thing for that people want money. Because it's not so much that they want the money in and of itself, but it's really because they're trying to create something, a better life for themselves and for their families. And certainly they should be able and allowed to do so. It becomes a question of how, right? And I think for me, this is where a novel technology comes into play, and green hydrogen presents that opportunity, right? If we know that the technology that we're currently using is going to be phased out, so the use of coal-fired power stations is going to be phased out. We're going to be using renewable energy. We're going to be using green hydrogen. We're going to be using less of gas and so on. Then it becomes necessary for us to also look at or rather to look at what the labor force is going to look like when that market, for instance, is fully developed, right? We might find that because it's in its nascent stages now, there isn't sufficient capacity in South Africa, expertise-wise, to fully deploy South Africans into these new technologies, right? And so we need to import labor from elsewhere. But in so doing, we also need to have timelines. And I think this for me is another key thing, right? How long do we intend on doing that for? Because at some point, as I said earlier, the young people are going to move into some of these positions. And when they do that, we can't want to think of only upskilling them at such a time, right? There has to be that forethought and foresight to say, there's going to be a new industry coming in and we need to create the labor force for that, so that when that market is ready, they can be absorbed somewhere, right? And when we look at where they will be absorbed, we need to ensure things like, will those graduates, for instance, have sufficient remuneration for the work that they're going to be doing? Will the institutions of higher learning afford them the kind of skills and training that is going to allow them to live the kind of lives that they want to live, both from a professional perspective, but also from a private? Although, excuse me, of course, the private one, it's a very different space, right? Because you choose what you want in that space. But certainly the work environment is a major contributor to your private life. So we need to look at opportunities and the education, I think, in a similar fashion. And this is why I wanted to respond to it in this way, because the opportunities that are present in green hydrogen at this stage are still early enough for us to take students and learners into that space, right? So your STEM students predominantly. Similarly, the lead time, let's say if the market only matures or industry only matures in 15 years, we should have a sufficient number of people. If, for instance, we decided today that we're going to prioritize green hydrogen education, capacitated and educated enough in 15 years to then lead when the industry becomes really matured. Because once you do that, then we don't find ourselves in a space wherein there's a gap in the people that are skilled versus the people that are unskilled and unemployed, right? We would have plugged in that gap because it would have taken a preemptive step to make that decision. So there are opportunities. And maybe the question becomes then also, how do we then advertise some of these opportunities? How do we incentivize people from so-called fence land communities from these provinces to be put in programs that would allow them to become skilled to enter into these spaces? But I think certainly these are the things that, as an organization, as an individual, are the kinds of conversations to have when you're sitting with the state, right? It's not so much about what you guys want to do for us, it's about what we want to do for you as well, but also for us to agree together, how are we going to be able to get from point A to point B? What needs to happen? Who's going to be doing what? And then we pull in that direction. That way, in 20 years' time, we know that a Priska, which is very dry at this moment, is going to look very different today as it will be in 20 years' time. And the people who lived in that area would have had a very direct hand in making sure that it reflects the views that they would have wanted 20 years prior. I hope that offers some kind of a response. But Razan, if I missed a specific question to yours, please let me know. Thank you.
Thank you, Tando. We have other hands on the chat, Palani, and then Sidor, you'll go after.
Oh, yes. Thanks, Tando. Yeah, the question is a follow-up of that one of the government and civil society relationship, especially on this issue. So I want to emphasize, it's true to say, because civil society mostly is, everyone is working in silos. We were able, I mean, the government was able to send their own people without information, without even in the international fora. So I think this is the time whereby civil society need to come together. Like if organization like is specialized in this issue of hydrogen process, that is the organization supposed to represent civil society as a whole in this matter, especially in the policy formulation and also in the direction on the environment and diversity and climate change. So I think I appeal for this to say, I mean, really, I think it's the right time to say civil society must organize themselves as we are doing now. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Sidwell, you can go next, please.
Okay, greetings. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, mine is just a short question. We know that green hydrogen, requires substantial renewable electricity, which might divert resources away from sectors like direct electrifications, your electrical vehicles, homes. So this could potentially slow down progress in other critical areas of decarbonization. So how do we address these negative impacts?
Thank you, Sidwell. Farai, would you like to address that?
Thank you very much for that question, Sido. I think that is a very important question. We don't want to go much into the details, but there are mechanisms, and I think I highlighted that in my presentation, and it speaks to that point around additionality. Are there any additional, I was saying, whatever renewable energy that you are using, firstly, is it not being removed from any other use case for renewable electricity or any electricity for that matter, for households and communities and other business operations in place. So I think that is quite important. And also looking at, and I think that is where, in terms of our planning point of view, from a policy perspective and aligning things, that's what we need to look at. And I think the priority should always be to decarbonize our electricity grid, especially from a South African point of view. We know that the grid is highly carbon intensive, and various aspects of the economy are facing different pressures, particularly with the impending carbon border adjustment mechanism from the European Union and potentially other jurisdictions like the US and the UK and so forth. So there's definitely significant pressures and definitely significant opportunities, even economically, that comes from decarbonizing the grid. And also that is the least cost movement that we need to do to move towards that part. So I think that is always should be the priority, and our initial interventions should be moving towards that. As much as, and then from then on, we can sort of move on to kind of what are the next hanging fruits in what we can achieve. And I think one of the challenges was that as a country, we've been having piecemeal energy planning. You know, we have a plan for electricity and a plan for transport and a plan for that. And now at the end of the day, we're trying to plug in those plans to see how best they fit in our entire energy sector. And I think that is the role for where coherent energy planning comes in, particularly in the form of an integrated energy plan. So we'll then look at our goal in terms of decarbonization and the different sectors, and looking at which are the priority sectors from a time-sensitive point of view, and then how can then, with each subsequent addition of renewables onto that or into our grid, and how do we make and utilize them. So I think that is also a critical aspect that we need to take in and consider from a holistic energy planning point of view. But also noting that some of these projects are independent projects. I mean, for example, Bokupai, which can just be that project in that particular corner of the Northern Cape. And it could be designed in such a way, not only that one, but others where you have islanded effects or effects happening in a small part of that community or part of that region. So how can we then make sure that whatever inputs we're doing with that project, how can it go on to support the communities around that area as well? And that's what Stan was also mentioning in a presentation. But there's nothing set in stone, policy or otherwise. And we hear a lot about project developers saying we're going to do this for the community, we're going to do that, but none of this eventually materializes. But how can that be part of the project planning and how we can do ahead? So I think that is one of the things that we can do from a policy wise. And as mentioning in terms of the different criteria and the sustainability of what determines what is sustainable. In Europe, they do have regulations in terms of what qualifies in green hydrogen, and part of those screening includes at what time were the renewables produced and what time was the renewable plant operated. For instance, if you're now using electricity from a plant that was built 5 years ago, it's not additional, for instance. So those are the things that we then need to look and include. So not a simple answer, but I think there are solutions that we can work on to try and mitigate some of those challenges.
Thank you. We have 7 minutes left. So I'm not sure if it's enough time for I to go through some of the questions that you have on Menti.
Yeah, I see
But I
there's
see, yeah, but I see there are more questions on Q&A. And okay, there's another hand up now. Okay, I'll just read one question and then we'll go to Bidu. So this question is from Siso. He says, how do we increase local demand and beneficiation for greenhouse gas, for green hydrogen and its derivatives in South Africa and minimize export market, since there's a huge market for green hydrogen in Europe. Notably, there are competing interests for green hydrogen production in developing regions to satisfy Europe's market demands, while also as a country having the obligation to meet our NDCs.
okay. Thank you very much for. Let me see that. Yeah, apologies. Thank you very much for that question. And I think the local demand, I think, is a very critical aspect of it. And that is a challenge that we have because, as you rightly pointed out in your question, most of this hydrogen is earmarked for export. And the huge challenge there is centered around the cost of this green hydrogen. So most of this green hydrogen can fetch a higher price in Europe because of the incentives that we have there. Unfortunately, in our part of the world, we can't afford similar mechanisms and incentives. So what's important, I think, also comes from policy direction. I guess the integrated energy plan is one of them. So that would help to highlight and kind of demonstrate where in our economy this demand could come from. So I think that is a key aspect to consider in terms of increasing local demand. The second one would be to look at those existing sectors where it's local demand, but we have a kind of a big export footprint. So for instance, looking at how the demand for certain steel mills, for instance, where we export some of our steels and using green hydrogen in there, as well as some other chemical products that we do and export. So those are some of those opportunities where we can use local demand, targeting initially that local market. The challenge, as I mentioned, is the current high costs, which makes it very challenging to absorb some of those costs from a local perspective. But if you can plan and have a phased approach, then there are certain aspects of the economy where we can absorb it immediately, earmarked for those exports markets, and also starting to build on our capacity in terms of what we can take and the policy direction to guide us towards that goal.
Thanks, Farai. I see we don't have any more questions, so I suggest we go to the Menti question because we have 4 minutes left.
Thank you very much, everyone. I think this has been a very, thank you very much for your engagement. I think this was very lovely. Unfortunately, we don't have more time. So what I'll do quickly is I do have some other questions on Menti. I'm not sure how much we'll be able to cover and go through, but I'm hoping that we at least we can get some engagement and move forward. Can you see the screen, please?
Yes, we can.
Oh. So yeah, so still the Menti code from the last time, as well as the QR code. So please just take a note and just move to the next question. So I think the first one is just trying to understand from you. Some of you has raised those issues in the discussion and the conversation, and we take note of that. If you haven't voiced any, or if you want to let us know again, please just let us know sort of what you're most concerned about when it comes to the green hydrogen. I think as we were speaking, issue around skills and issue around skills, I think was a big issue, and also the role of communities as well as water, I think were some of the things that we picked up from the discussion. So if you could just add there as well, would really appreciate it. Okay, so is it just environmental impacts? I'm posting in the chat the link to the Menti. So you can just click the link that I put in the chat and it will take you to the presentation where you can also just input your answers. I am aware that we are over time, and yeah, thank you everyone for those who joined us thus far. If you are able to spare us another 10 or so minutes for this, we would really appreciate it if you have time. But otherwise, thank you very much for your engagement. And I think it's quite clear we're getting the message that as civil society, we need to take a more stronger position, a coordinated one on this. And I think with Tando here and SACAN and already the engagement in the local community, we are able, and I think we can use that mechanism to take this work forward and position ourselves better. So yeah, I think that the team will work around that and coordinate it and take it forward. And already good to see some of those practical things, as Tando mentioned, that we can take to get going along that journey. Yeah, so thank you very much. If you can spare us another 10 minutes, you can just participate in our Menti poll there. So I think we have about 14 responses so far. So when your perspective, what are you most concerned about when it comes to the green hydrogen economy? So about 17 responses so far. Just give it another 30 seconds if you still want to input on this particular slide. Okay, I'll move on to the next one. So is there a critical topic other than what we've discussed that is missing in the current discourse around green hydrogen and its derivatives? Okay, so one person saying the approach. Yes, so the results definitely will be shared by the team. So as we compile this, we'll compile the PDF. The team will compile the PDF slides and then share it together with the slides from this session and the recording. Thank you, Sido. Anyone else, if you think there's a critical topic that we're missing, please give your inputs there. Thank you very much for those that are inputting so far. Okay, so definitely skill development, I think it comes out strongly. And from my perspective and what I've picked up during the conversation is to that alignment between what we can get or what opportunities there are and how the communities can reach to them. And I think that is quite a critical topic that would involve obviously the business side of things, and we need to do some further work on that. Thank you very much. So yeah, if yeah, please do feel free, I guess, when we send out these results, if you haven't given any input and would like to add your response afterwards the session, please feel free to do that. And this last question is just, the next question is asking if there are any other solutions or strategies that you can suggest to ensure that we minimize our effect on social, economic, and environmental impacts. So from my presentation, Thando's presentation, as well as Nokotaba's inputs, we also tried to address some of that question. If you have any further inputs on that, please feel free to share. I'll leave it up on there for the next minute or so. Okay, indigenous knowledge systems, and I think that is a key one, and beneficiation of local raw material to create jobs. Okay, I think that's more important, and more collaboration. Wonderful. Thank you very much for your inputs. Anyone else? I'll give it another 30 seconds. As a reminder, I'll just put the link again. You can click on that link and it will take you straight to the Menti slide where you can give your inputs. Give another 30 seconds on that. Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those responses. Okay, the linkage to agroecology and permaculture, I think that's an important dimension, which I didn't speak much of in our presentation today, because I think also the importance of practices like agrovoltaics, where you combine agriculture with renewable energy. I think that could be also an important aspect for systems where you have localized or modular green hydrogen project design, which could be beneficial for economies, for communities. And I think, you know, future work on this needs to go forward. And again, future workshops on this concept. I think the team is hearing that. We need to include that as well. Thank you. And then this question is maybe for those that have engaged a bit with the advocacy work and the policy work as it stands. So assume if you've not, as I know most of the people that are on this webinar are not familiar with this topic, they may not be aware of such gaps. But if you've identified or seen any gaps during or from your work on green hydrogen, please let us know, because it also just helps organizations like ourselves as we do these engagements to kind of then see what that landscape is and trying best to see how best all the stakeholders and mostly community-based organizations can impact and participate in this. I think it's quite important to just get some perspectives on what you think is missing so that you can take it forward. Upskilling of labor, thank you very much, and awareness in communities, and the thing that's been coming through. I'll give that another 30 seconds before I move on to the last question. I think it's the last question that I have. Yes, I think an important point there that I see on the screen regarding more research that is needed, and the language of presentation should be simple. I think that's a key question. It is quite a technical topic, and I apologize for having to rush through it and not explaining some of the terms or taking time to delve down on the matters. But I think this was just to set the scene and introduce broadly the topic and the challenges. and definitely need to do a bit more delve in deeper and potentially look to make it a more simpler presentation for other stakeholders. So thank you very much for that. Yes, and I think also stakeholder engagement is noted as a priority but not acted upon. So I think that's definitely in terms of where some of us advocacy efforts means, because we've got this policy that's saying this must be done, but it's actually not being done. So yeah, I think that is quite important, and I think access to market is also key, which is linked to the socio-economic aspects and the job creation opportunities. Okay, thank you very much for that. And I will move on to the last one. I think some of this question has been answered already in some form in the previous slides. So if you have some thoughts on this one, please feel free to add those thoughts the next minute or so. Yeah, and I think as that is up in the next minute, as people put in their responses, then I'll hand back over to the CARP team who have hosted us this afternoon, and just hand over to them for the closeout. In the meanwhile, I will just keep this last question on the screen for you to give your inputs. Thank you very much.
In essential, would you like to make any closing remarks?
Yeah, sorry, I thought Mary Jo was going to do that. Okay, yeah, I just want to thank everyone for your time today. Thank you for bearing with us even with the 10 minutes over. We really thank you for your inputs. It was indeed a very interactive session. We will share with you presentations and as well as the results of the Mentimeter as soon as possible. Again, thank you, and looking forward to seeing you at our future webinars. Bye, everyone.